fairly pro-GMO and been highly critical of
Genetically modified organisms,
and critical of a lot of the anti-GMO movement, which is largely pseudoscientific. Previously, you have stated you were concerned about the effects of GMO, but then you've given some indication that maybe your opinion on this matter has evolved.
Given some indications. Yeah, so I did a show called The Eyes of Nine, and I had some very interviewed some people who had really strong opinions, and I agree with them. That here's how there's two questions, two words rather, two words. The first word we have to talk about is modified. The second word we have to talk about is safe. So when you modify organisms, people have been doing that for how long they've been farming? 10,000 years. And I remind everybody there is nothing natural about farming. I mean, without human or except humans are a product of evolution and so on. But a farm, if you let it go, it reverts to grassland or forest or whatever you have the situation. All right, so to modify organisms, you know, the grapes and tomatoes and cows and whatever we have running around today are a result of 10,000 years of messing around. Selective breeding, what Darwin called artificial selection. Now, artificial in the 19th century, I think, was a little different usage than except for certain people at certain cocktail parties. Humans are not really artificial. But they're inducing changes, okay, or generation to generation. And so that's one kind of modification. And so the question is, when you put a gene in from somewhere else into an organism, from a different species, species. Transgenic, yeah. Then can you, is that thing still, let's say, two questions, safe to eat, but much, much, much more important to me, is it safe in the ecosystem? So what happened, I think, having done some more research, genetically modified organisms, soybeans and corn, cotton, were introduced kind of the same weekend as the bovine spongiform encephalitis, the mad cow disease, BSE, in Europe. And people in Europe got very concerned. If you got the Ministry of Agriculture that thinks it's okay to feed ground up cows to cows, that is, to force cows to be cannibals, then can you trust them with their genetically modified transgenic crops? And so it got in Europe especially, genetically modified organisms got a very bad rap. And because it got conflated or mixed together, I think, with this BSE. All right. What you don't want is the unintended consequences. So when you breed wheat by shaking the pollen of one wheat plant onto the eggs or ova of another, the way George Washington did with the magnifying glass, you can be pretty sure that you're not going to introduce a species that's going to wreak havoc or unexpected consequences in the ecosystem. So the great, amazing thing that these guys figured out was how to put a gene that okay, so there's an herbicide called glyphosate, which goes by the brand name Roundup. And it is like black magic. It inhibits the shikimic acid pathway, the second to last step in plant metabolism, making more plant. It kills it. So if you put Roundup on any green plant, it freaking kills it. Unless this plant has been engineered, has a gene from another species that allows it to make the shikimic acid or complete the pathway anyway. All right. So what happened is, with this extraordinary technology, two things happened. First of all, people were frightened by it because it's so deadly, it kills everything, every plant. And the other thing that happened is everybody started using it. And so one of the unintended consequences in the U.S. was the monarch butterflies. there are only 10% of the monarch butterflies left than there used to be even 20 years ago. That's not very long ago, everybody, 20 years ago. And it's mostly a result of the loss of their habitat. The loss of their habitat has been urban spread, urban sprawl. And glyphosate kills milkweed. And milkweed is the plant. There's a couple of varieties of milkweed, but there's one variety of milkweed that the butterflies just have to have. And so you can argue, or I argue, that by not going about farming in this extraordinary way, you would not have an unintended consequence like the devastation of the monarch butterfly population. But upon further review, I think the problem is not inherent, not at all, has almost nothing to do with genetically modifying the plants. Instead, it has to do with just every sort of agricultural, urban planning scheme. And by the way, last week I flew, I was in a plane to Minneapolis. And what about your carbon footprint? I know. I flew to Minneapolis to the butterfly meeting. No. So we have non-governmental organizations and the hated Monsanto. They are trying to figure out how to establish what I describe as a hopscotch highway for monarch butterflies to get from Mexico to Canada. It really is, these butterflies are just extraordinary. I mean, they're just like, what the heck? I've watched them. It's in my book. I've watched them. They can fly up by flying very, very close to the ground, taking advantage of wind gusts and stuff. It's really amazing. And one of the things that was not known at this meeting was how far away a butterfly can smell a milkweed. And that seems to me a very important data that we have to figure out. But they got this big corporation there and these do-gooder nonprofits like the Pheasants Forever. These are hunters that really like to have birds around. But the habitat for huntable birds is the same as the habitat for these butterflies. And the reason the butterflies are significant, first of all, they're important, they're beautiful, they're iconic. But my claim, and I don't think this is extraordinary, but if you're able to wipe out something as obvious as millions and millions of butterflies, what else have you kind of wiped out without really being aware of it, right?
But I agree. I think that the problem is not genetification. The problem is that we're trying to feed 7 billion people.
Yeah.
Farming.
By the way, these guys in this business, ConAgra and the hated Monsanto, they're sure that they're going to have 2% less farmland in 30 years than we have today. And so they believe through extraordinary modern farming practices, they can feed what will be around 9 billion people in 30 years. Yeah. You know, there was just a few years ago, there were estimates of 12 billion people, but they think people think it'll be less than that. Only 9 billion. And so my ambivalence about genetically modifying crops has changed. Absolutely. I see that they have great value, but I also warn us all that the unintended consequences, or so-called knock-on consequences, are still significant, and we really don't know how to solve an obvious, everybody can see a problem like the monarch butterfly.
So there are unintended consequences to not doing things.
Absolutely.
So not doing GMOs into more farmland has a greater negative impact than.
Oh, and by the way, this just in. There's another plant, the Aranthus flower, Aranthus is a whole genus, I'm not a botanist. It's from the Latin for forever flower, which I translate as roughly you just can't kill it. The Aranthus, and it's called, usually it's called pigweed. And pigweed has evolved in just the last 20 years to overcome glyphosate by amplifying a gene. What could have a real bad consequence in an animal if the gene repeats. the gene repeat in the pigweed is great. It makes so much shikimic acid that, or the enzyme, related to shikimic acid, that it overcomes glyphosate.
Anything we do will
Glyphosate,
be resistant.
what?
Anything we do will be resistant.
Yeah, so they have another plan to use another insecticide, rather herbicide called the dicamba, which is an old contraction of dimethyl amazing gibberellulate or something. So they believe that they can stack the genes. They'll have the gene to get you through glyphosate, the gene to get you through dicamba, and the gene to get you through the European corn borer program. And it's extraordinary. And I will say, just objectively, Monsanto is in a transition from an industrial chemical company to a biotech